Okay, we're live. We're live. What's up,
Rednecks
guys?
Day.
John Sentez here. Cutternation podcast. A little chilly this morning. I don't know why, but no
It
big
is
deal.
San Diego. What is
I
going
know, right?
on?
Yeah, dude. I woke
It
up and I
feels
was like,
like
dude, I gotta put
February.
a long sleeve on. Anyway, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. The podcast numbers have been going up tremendously. I appreciate everybody who's been following along and everybody subscribed. Seems like YouTube is the best place where people are loving to go to watch it, but don't forget it's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. We're trying to align ourselves with Joe Rogan since he's going full Spotify in September, which is gangbusters.
Really?
Yeah, audio and video, all Spotify. Yeah.
Only on Spotify?
Only on Spotify.
I had no idea.
Yeah, gnarly.
Why?
He doesn't go into that, but I can imagine.
I don't mean to
he has a bunch of issues
but I just started
YouTube and like how they monetize his videos, because if he says something, they demonetize it, and so he's just probably tired of getting demonetized and just moved over to Spotify, where he has just like they gave him probably the Titanic worth of money and said, just do it right here, do whatever you want.
Well, it's interesting because I hadn't listened to Spotify before. I know we're killing your intro, Wes, but whatever. This
he's a veteran.
Whatever. No, I just started using Spotify like last week because somebody was sharing playlists back and forth, and this is the first time I've listened to their ads, and their ads are way different than Pandora. It's really interesting how anyway, interesting. That's all I have to say. So sorry to kill it. John, you wanna? Well, this is Weston Germain, guys. Mill City Throwing.
Yeah, go ahead.
From beautiful Minneapolis, Minnesota. He was on a couple of weeks ago with Jamie DeStache, like mustache. Never forget that again. Yep. So anyway, they've been doing a project. I'll let kind of Wes go about kind of getting you caught up, giving us a little cliff notes of what they've done. But before he does, I will say, and John, I don't even know if you know this, but this has basically put Wes at the top of the Modus Sleeve world. And I know he doesn't want to accept that, but he's in some really cool conversations right now. So for those of you that don't know, Wes will update you on what Modus Sleeve is, but this is some technology that, holy crap, right? So I'll let Wes take over, but this is, if you haven't seen it, go back and watch the other episode with him and Jamie, because both of them are working on this together and gave a great perspective. So, come on, Johnny. Come on, Donnie. Let's go. All right, Wes.
Yeah. So I guess I'll start by saying I'm really uncomfortable with that, what you just said. But I think that we're in the very early stages of understanding that this technology is going to be really important, and kind of going down the rabbit holes that pop up along the way. So I think Modus Sleeve, or like the wearable tech that can measure arm stress, is going to be super important in the future, and we're just kind of diving into how to use that. So to kind of catch everybody up and give a little recap of what we talked about the last time I was on, basically Jamie and I have been, over the course of the past 9 months to a year, have been reworking interval throwing programs because of the way that we were having to use them with our athletes and the questions that came up along the way. And in our evaluation of these programs and the learning of the technology with Modus Sleeve, we kind of landed on what we think is a better way to do things. So we mapped out a new program. And over the past 9 weeks, I have been going to the park and essentially testing 2 different interval throwing programs. So one is the interval throwing program that you'll find if you go to the ASMI's website, and the other one is the one that we designed. So I've got them all mapped out, and all we're basically doing is throwing these protocols and tracking 1-day workload, arm stress, acute to chronic workload ratio, and seeing do any of these programs, or does either of these programs build workload in a more efficient way? Do they do it safer? And just kind of evaluating those things. And I guess as briefly as I can, I'll go into an explanation of what acute and chronic workload are. So basically, if you think of chronic workload as your arm's fitness, it's 28 days. Like, what is your average 1-day workload over 28 days? So what kind of fitness does your arm have? And acute workload is like what fatigue you've placed on your arm in the past 9 days. So it's the average 1-day workload over the past 9 days. And when you get the ratio and you divide the acute by the chronic, there have been studies that show that when you go over a 1.3 on that ratio, you're at an increased risk for injury. Not that you will definitely get injured, obviously, but just that the risk goes up. So we're kind of monitoring the AC ratio on these two throwing programs.
So it'd be like normally I have my routine, and then all of a sudden it's playoffs and I get asked to throw 3 times in 5 days. Is that what we're talking about? That would spike the ratio and that'd be higher than 1-3?
Yeah, so I mean, depending on the volume that you throw, obviously, but that's something that could happen.
Well, John's throwing 300 pitches a game, so let's assume a high volume.
Yeah, so if he's throwing 300 pitches a game and he does that throughout a season, his chronic workload, his fitness is going to be like built up to handle that. So he'll have a chronic workload of whatever that number is. But if he went from throwing 300 pitches a game once a week to, okay, now he's going to throw 200 pitches a game 3 times a week, that would be a jump in the acute workload that the chronic workload isn't built up to handle. So you could see it at that end. What you'd actually, I think studies or like some research has shown that in the playoffs, what actually happens as games get more spread out is you see a drop in chronic workload because guys aren't throwing as often. And then the game comes and they don't have the fitness level to handle what's asked of them. So on the other side,
that's a good point, because the travel days are definitely weird as it goes. Like, especially if you go 7 games, your 5 to 7 thing. I'm pretty sure, right? The strategy would say that you drop your 5th starter and you try to get back to number 1 as quick as possible, right? So very interesting findings there, Mr. Germain.
Yeah, and on the other side of things, then you've got like the on-ramping problem, which is what we're going to see coming up here, where like if you come in, if for example, if Minnesota decides we're going to start summer ball on June 1st and today's May 20th or whatever it is, like that's not a very big window to build up chronic workload. So if you haven't been throwing, if your fitness isn't where it's supposed to be, you can't just hop in and start throwing in a game the way you want to, because you're going to see a huge acute spike or acute to chronic workload ratio spike and presumably be at higher risk for injury. So And I think just in general that athletes aren't super good at gauging how much work they've been doing. So it'll be interesting.
I will offer for in defense of the athlete. I don't know how many coaches are good at asking questions that would allow the athlete to develop that skill set. That's one of the things that we really have leaned into hard, is just like, this isn't about, don't point fingers. Let's just have a conversation here. So this is cool because we've at Cutternation, we've been like, one of the simplest things we have is like, 1 to 10, 10 being terrible, how much pain are you in? And like the amount of people that walk in and are like, 3, what are you talking about? You just walked in the door.
Yeah.
3, and just, they don't get asked these questions, like they don't show up to practice and say, hey, this is where I'm at. I'm at a 2 out of 10 today, or I'm at a 5 out of 10 today. It's just like, why? Hey, yeah. Anyway, you know what we're coming from.
Yeah, I think asking the questions is huge, and then as much as we can, providing tools or providing a way for them to like keep track of these things. Like even something as simple as, hey, I threw today. Okay, how much? Well, I threw, 100 throws. Okay, at what RPE? Like that's a way to track workload. It's not
rate of perceived effort.
Right. It's not nearly as good as like having an actual torque metric, but it's better than nothing. And it can enter, like you said, it can bring athletes into these conversations. But
so we'll obviously have a lot of time to like get to the conclusions and go out to that. Can you actually go into a little bit more of the process? Because what I want people to understand is like the biggest reason why what Weston is doing is like the biggest reason it's such a significant thing is because there's so much time. Like, and if this wasn't happening, we've talked about, with the virus being here, like this is something that is really hard to set aside time to do it the right way. And you're doing it the right way. So talk a little bit more about the process and how vigorous it is.
Yeah. So like to your point, really, if the past 9 weeks we had been in season, there's basically no way that I'm able to throw these protocols and document the process the way that I've been able to. So this has been a silver lining, I guess, for me personally, and that it's given me an opportunity to kind of dive down this rabbit hole. But yeah, so I mean, I throw every day. It seems there are some days where the protocols line up where they're both scheduled off. So but for the most part, because I'm throwing 2 different protocols on 2 different schedules, there's throwing on every day. Walk over to the park, throw, come back, record the data, look at the data, make some notes for, I've been doing the weekly review blog posts. So I make notes along the way so that when I type those up, I've got some things to touch on. And then along the way, like this past week, for example, I found that there was another, like a new topic to go down that just kind of cropped up because halfway through my throwing session on, I don't know, we'll call it Monday, I had soreness in my oblique area and I had to stop throwing. So I had to think about, like, how does this program adjust? How would the other programs adjust? And so then I end up writing a blog post about that because it sends me down a rabbit hole and I, put the thoughts on paper. So
specifically you're talking about like having a bad day in the middle of return to throw, right?
Yeah. So like for a traditional throwing program, let's say it's like, okay, today is the day I need to throw 50 throws at 120 feet. Okay. So what happens if I get to throw 25 and I feel something that's no good? Like my elbow, I've got sharp pain.
Happens all the time.
Whatever. Yeah. Whatever it is. Okay. So now the protocol says stop throwing and don't throw until the pain stops, which makes sense. Like if you're in a good setting, you'd be able to go get treatment, like manual therapy, whatever, and eventually you're pain free. You can throw again. Maybe that's one day, maybe it's 3. But then the instructions in a traditional throwing program say, go back to the last step and continue from there. And it doesn't really adjust anything else. But
like just in general, they say like there's no backtracking or like a delay of the curve for it to come back up. Or?
Right.
We're week 3, go back to week 1.
Well, so it'll be like at that point, let's just say you're in step 10. So step 10 is 50 throws at 120 feet. And they say, okay, you had soreness, you weren't able to do this. Let's go back to step 9, which is 25 throws at 120 feet and continue from there. So you'll like take 2 or 3 days off and then you'll go back to that step and continue. But what we found when you're looking at 1-day workloads and when you're looking at chronic workload, like if you take 3 days off or 4 days off because you were sore, that is a significant change in chronic workload. And the program doesn't adjust to it at all. So what happens is over the next 3 weeks, you're at a spiked AC ratio for 3 weeks until it finally balances out because of the 28-day window. So that's what a traditional throwing program would do. But with ours, because ours is based not on throw count, but 1-day workload, you say, okay, well, you made 25 throws, you were going for 50. What was your workload today? You type that in and you type in zeros for the next however many days that you're out. And then you just adjust the program. You say, okay, well, the next time out, you're going to throw at whatever intensity you were supposed to throw at, but you're going to make fewer throws. And we're going to adjust the 1-day workload to gradually get you back up in a safe way because you can do that because you're not guessing about workload.
This just popped in my head, and I know this sounds a little different than the first time, but it's like, this is why I was suggesting, like, what if you just threw max effort once every time you threw? And I know that there are faults in that idea, but where I was coming from was, I think that the volume is the thing that people are so scared to manage. And and maybe I'm saying that wrong. Maybe I should be saying the intensity is what they're trying to manage. But anyway, it's just these simple things where I feel like
could be both.
Sure. And what I'm thinking about is the traditional practice where the pitchers or whoever is supposed to go throw for X amount of time. And it's like, me stopping before that is not going to look good. And that's not the point. Like there should be, an environment where, I don't have that. You go back to, all of our injuries. I don't know, Wes, you haven't really had significant injuries.
No, but I don't throw very hard.
Yeah.
Like,
so
that's why
I knew you were going to say that, but yeah, anyway. But you also throw a billion throws. Like Wes can throw today and then 3. Yeah. No, but that's what it was. Is I was as a sophomore, I was literally scared to tell somebody that I was feeling discomfort, because I didn't want that to affect my playing time. I didn't want that to it's such a psychological game. So anyway, that just a side note, because that's the reality. My story is not unique.
Right. And it goes back to like asking the athletes the right questions and then giving the athletes some authority over what they're doing. So, and not to keep talking about like the specific program that we built up, but like in a traditional interval throwing program, it's step 9, step 10, step 11, and they just build in volume or intensity along the way. And there's never, like, there are off days, they throw every other day. But for example, in our program, you might throw, like right now I'm throwing at 90% of previous max velocity, and I'm throwing 5 days a week. But I'm only throwing hard twice a week. And my other days of throwing, I don't even take a radar gun. I just go out and I lob the ball until I hit my workload for the day. It's like completely self-regulated. So it gives me that option to just do whatever feels right for my arm and rest. And, and if there's a day where I want to push it, I can a little bit, but it's on the athlete to base it on how they feel and let them start to get to know their arm, and not only what their arm can handle, but what their arm wants and needs. Because I think a lot of athletes are used to doing whatever their arm can handle on a given day and not what's, best for their arm.
That's an interesting point. Our concept of 20% day, I'm pretty sure you're familiar with it.
Yep.
I feel like that you're shedding some light on that idea of what we've been talking about with that, and it might actually be way more valuable than what people are anticipating. So I'm really excited to see what research you've gotten from that, because it's, I don't even know. Cass, do you remember where we came up with that, or where I came up with that, or how it came to fruition?
I no, because you had it by the time I came, but not to take anything away from you. I like that. One of the things that kids always want to say is, I'll ask them, whether it's in person or remote training, what percent are we on today? 100%, 20%, 50%. And I mean, even some of our veterans will be like 75%. I'm like, well, that's not an option. You just have to commit to the idea. So these are like, I think that Cressy does like a high intensity, medium intensity, low intensity. Driveline calls them different hybrid A, hybrid B kind of things. So like typically everybody has some sort of version of this. But just to speak to what you're trying to say, John, is like, I don't think most of our people don't come to us at 20%. Right. So when we're doing in-person training, they don't see the value in these days. And one of the things that I've tried to harp on is like, you cannot decide, oh, I threw yesterday in a game, I'm canceling my training session today. It's like, no, these are the ways that, like, this is something that I've said specifically. The reason why you want to come to Cutternation on these 20% days is because most people are not giving that kind of information, right? So when Wes, you're bringing this up, like most people aren't purposely doing that. You already alluded to it. So it's just like, yeah, anyway, this is cool that you're putting numbers to it.
Well, and to your point,
go ahead, Wes.
To your point about 75% not being an option, like the increments that you guys give are great, because there have been studies that show that like athletes aren't good at matching their RPE with what is actually happening. And what you'll actually see if you ask somebody to throw at 75% is it's much more likely that they're going to expose themselves to like 90% of torque rather than 75. So giving them 50, knowing you might get 65, and giving them 20, knowing you might get 40 or 45, like that's really smart. And 20 sounds low to people, but if I try to throw 20, I'm not going to throw 20. I'm going to be somewhere, around or just below 50. So, but if you tell a kid to go have an 85% day, that's a 100% day.
100%. I totally agree. It's one of the main reasons that I thought of the radar gun on all days of throwing for guys that gives them way better of a feedback. But I didn't know what it was going to do. I didn't realize how much it was going to carry into our program like that, because like you're saying, most of the time you look at top end velos, and now we set speed limits on guys all the time. When we ask them, what's your day? And the college guys love it, hate it. But if you throw a ball over 75 or 80 today, you're done.
Yep.
And they're like, oh, but I feel good. I'm like, that's not the point.
Yeah, I don't care. Yeah, that's
I thought of
it's huge.
Well, just psychologically, I think about like you guys know I listen to a ton of Jordan Peterson, and he was talking about how if you at the age of like 4 or 5 haven't learned how to delay gratification, your life is going to be so much harder. And that's literally what we're talking about right now, is like seeing your future self and seeing the community that you are. I love that he says that. So like, you are not one person, you're a community of who you have been and who you are going to be. And that when we're starting to talk about human performance, you really have to think about your future self. You were alluding to, you need 4 weeks to simply establish a baseline of what chronic workload is. And so when John, I know that he's posted this a lot, it takes 6 weeks to get your arm in shape, like at minimum. And then you think about go.
Yeah, no, I mean, so it depends. This is another question that we're trying to grapple with, is like, what is in shape? Like, how much workload do you need to be able to handle for you to be considered in shape? And like a healthy arm returning, 6 weeks, you're way further along than somebody that's just coming out post-op and just getting out of the physical therapist's office, because you can start at a higher workload, or a higher intensity. But like, what is in shape? What does that athlete need to be able to do? And that's something that we're kind of figuring out with like our chronic workload. So for example, a starting pitcher in the MLB, like average chronic workload is around 15. Okay, but like you can return to competition before you're at 15. So what is that number? Like, you don't have to be able to throw 5 innings in a game before you can return to throw, and trying to figure out what that number is. And I think that number is going to be different by guy, by position, by coach, like coach's preference, when they want to use a guy in a game. So, but like 6 weeks, you can have
psychos like me. Like, that's when you said that, I resonated of like, my best season I ever had was when I was down in Mochi's, but I was a closer. I was a 6, 7, 8, 9 starter. And it was just like the whole season, start off as a closer, end up as the 8th inning guy, and then we needed more help first out of the pen in situations. And then the number 5 guy goes down, and then turn into a starter for a month, basically have 5 starts, come back to the pen, and looking at the different, I don't know how I did it, to be honest with you. Like,
right.
Well, think about what Vance has told us too. Tell him what Vance has talked about.
Go ahead. Which part are you talking about?
Well, so like Vance was a premier starter, right? He's on one of the best. He's on the best Phillies team that ever existed in 2011, right? And so he's like 5th, 6th starter, one of the best teams ever. And then as he gets away from the Phillies, he comes over to Minnesota. He's the opening day starter. And then it just was like lack of information, old school ideas. He shortens his stride. Like, he does all of these things to compensate for his lack of being in shape. And then what made him, stay in the game as long as possible was when he was in Baltimore, he was like, I had no idea if I was going to throw. I had no idea if I was going to be in the game. So what I got good at was being ready at all times. I needed to spot start. I needed to come into relief. And like, I can't even imagine. I can't imagine, because this is how, think about that. Think of the amount of dollars that are attached to this idea. How the hell are you ever going to filter what you actually think? Right? You're always going to be pushing for that. I did it at D3, right? I did it at D3. You want me to close and start game 2? Sweet. Love it.
Great.
And then you want me to close on Tuesday? Of course. And so it's interesting that, it's obviously one thing to hear it at the amateur level, but then to hear how big leaguers, like how challenging that must be. Do you know what I mean? And frick, the stress and the driving and the flying and the whole thing, just different level. So Anyway.
Yeah, and it's hard to navigate on its own. And I think that something that like a Moda sensor can do is at least provide some sort of information, right? Like some guidance as to what your arm needs on a given day. Because I would imagine that, having never been a relief pitcher, like navigating that would be very difficult, knowing like, okay, maybe I don't throw today, but like I need to throw some amount, or maybe I think I'm going to get into a game today, so I don't overdo it, then I don't get in. Well, now your 1 day workload is low, but you needed to accumulate some work to keep your chronic workload up. And like, it's a very complicated thing. And I think it's even more complicated if you don't have any actual any data, if you're just kind of guessing and going by feel.
Think about like the little leaguers and the younger guys that don't get it, and they don't get any notice, right? And like, it's one of the things that I try to tell parents all the time, to educate your coaches. I'm like, it is not fair for you to not tell the kid until 7:15 that he's starting at 8 o'clock in the morning on Saturday, that he has the first game, right? You don't even know what the kid's emotional state is. You have no idea. What if he was sleeping on his shoulder in the back of the van and he's got a kink in his neck, and he needs a couple hours to get the stiffness out, So it's
well, and what I've always said with the younger players is, this is why I get so jacked up about youth coaching, is like, there is zero reason why you can't make this happen. Do you know how easy it would be to take 13 10-year-olds and say, you're pitching on Monday, you're pitching on Tuesday, you're pitching on Wednesday, and then you other people, you're relief pitchers. And you're going to be, so Johnny, Tim, and Farrell, I don't know who that is, but those three guys, just making up names. They are going to be in relief on Monday, and do it. Don't not based on the game. What are we talking about? Based on the score of a Little League game? Like, I don't even care if you're in the Little League World Series, because if you coach like that, where you're telling them where they are and you're at the Little League World Series, you're not going to change it now. Oh, we got to playoffs. Let's change everything that we're doing.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I would say that a reasonable way to avoid having high pitch counts or asking too much of a 10, 11, 12-year-old pitcher would be to have everybody on your team pitch. And not everybody's going to be great, but guess what? They're 10, 11, and 12. And I don't know. I was 6 foot when I was 12 years old, but I had a buddy who was 5'1", and he's taller than me now. You don't know who's going to do what as they get older and go into high school. Teach them all how to pitch.
Gene Larkin was 5'9" as a senior in high school. 5'9", a point guard. He's 6'4".
Right. Yeah, so imagine him at 10 years old. They probably weren't looking. This is the guy I need to teach how to pitch. He was actually the best guy. But anyway, well, but you know what I mean.
I know exactly
that happens. That happens a lot where people get pigeonholed at a young age, and it's you don't know. Teach these kids how to do everything, and you might lose some Little League games, but
John was just talking to the Pitch Logic guy, episode 81. What's his name again? Or
Steven Security?
Yeah, and he was talking about, so he, with Pitch Logic, taught himself how to throw a true 12-6 curveball, 100% spin efficiency, straight top spin. But he was just talking about when he was in Little League, he's like, yeah, I only played 1 year of baseball because I was last in the order and they put me out in the outfield. And other kids, just the way that they were coached, and some things came a little bit more natural to them, they took the coaching way better. And I just the coaching didn't make sense to me. It was not appropriate for where I was at. And he's a huge fan, and that's so tough because, think about, there's just so many things that kids never develop until way later. And this is accepted. And then all of a sudden we get into the sports world and we project these weird things onto these kids, where it's hey, you should know music theory by the age of 10. What? Really? And that's kind of the things that we're asking some of these young athletes is hey, you don't know how to catch a fly ball at 10? You got to figure it out. That's just not how it works. So, but at the same time, I don't mean to, I was talking to Raj, the Synapse guy, the other night, and I think I'm going to make a concerted effort to do this. Is this isn't about people being bad people. This is simply that this industry is for many, many reasons has not had some of the things that would allow these things to happen sooner and faster. Right. And so we just have to take it for what it is and not crap on each other and just continue to have conversations like this. So, I'm only saying this out loud so people understand that if I am being critical of anybody, it's more because I feel bad for the athletes. I think about the kids that are trying as hard as they possibly can, show up and do all the right things, and they aren't given opportunities because youth coaches don't get paid. Youth coaches aren't in a position to be able to be experts in this, and the implications are pretty big. But anyway, I'll jump off that. I want to come back to, I don't know.
Sounded like a little personal message there.
Well, no, it's I want to make sure that we're differentiating, the problems are not personal to the humans, right? These are problems that exist because
personal to you, it's a good thing. You know what I mean? It's the same.
Yeah.
I say everything that we put in the gym is what I wish I had when I was 12.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know of another way. The funny thing with that too is playing Call of Duty and the history of how Call of Duty's come in, right? The joke that one of my best friends, who was way better than I was at that game, was he'd always be it doesn't matter how good you are. There's some 12-year-old in somewhere in part of the world who's got way more time than you ever will to become good at this game, and that's what he's going to do. And I think that that idea and like allowing kids to go into that is and safely is probably what one of the main things excites me about what Weston's study is, because if we can start teaching these kids better programming and understanding what true recovery or active rest throwing is, which really was what a 20% day is, in my opinion, it's way too beneficial, So all this tech, the pitch logic, the motor sleeve, the Rapsodo, the radar gun, all the slow motion cameras, all the stuff comes down to hacking in the best possible way that we can. How can we just fix whatever issues, present themselves, and can we predict issues that are coming in the future?
I have an interesting thing. So last night I did remote training with Tandy. And so John brings him up all the time because Ryan is one of the most talented young players that I've ever seen. And so last night, John has been working a lot with him on pitches and sequencing. And last night, I was working on movement with him. And a little bit of it was like technology was struggling. It was harder for him to hear me, blah, blah, blah. But I talked to his mom afterward because I'm like, listen, I want to make sure that the message was heard from your side, right? Because this is something that we're going to continue to build on, and it seemed a little bit confusing. But this is the point. So I told her, I go, the funny thing is in the middle of the session, I had suggested he do something, and he goes, Cass, my arm feels like it's dragging when I do that. And I go, Nicole, your kid just gave, and then he asked me just like a really, really smart question. And I'm like, your kid just asked me a college level question, and I don't know how to answer it in a 10-year-old's vernacular, right? I'm like, if you would have asked me a 10-year-old question, I know how to answer that in a 10-year-old's voice. But when you ask me a question that well, like what 10-year-old knows that his arm drags, And so I told her, I'm like, listen, your kid's awareness is off the charts. I don't know people that have the awareness of that, but also I need a little help from mom here because I don't know how to speak his language all the time. Because I'm like, well, it's really, really hard. So anyway, I won't get further into that, but kids are so smart and so complicated, and man, it's a scary world. So if you can just say, hey, Tandy, like, look, you're that throw, even though you felt like your arm was dragging, well, the motor sleeve number says that was the same as all the other ones. It felt funny. It can just help inform them. So I'm just thinking out loud here.
It's another piece of the puzzle for sure.
Yeah.
So
okay, what else?
I was just going to say, let's get into the meat of the study here. Maybe quick sum it up real fast and then get us to where we're at.
Yeah, so some things that we learned basically from week 3 to week 9. So just in week 3, when we talked beginning of April, I was throwing 55% of my max velocity. I'm up to 90% in our protocol. I was throwing 75 feet in the traditional interval throwing program, and now I'm like, it has me prescribed as throwing 60 throws off of a mound at 50%. So that's just kind of how everything has progressed. Basically, some things that we learned were kind of confirmed over the past 6 weeks. Using throw counts and distance for intensity is pretty unpredictable. So if you go out and throw, like this past couple of days, I had to throw 45 throws at 50% RPE. These are like pitching mechanic throws. My workload per day has fluctuated wildly because, like we mentioned earlier, athletes aren't very good at predicting perceived effort. So my 50% on Monday feels different, or is different than what I thought was 50% on Saturday. And the same thing at 120 feet. And then even worse, it's between athletes. You can't really predict what their torque exposure is going to be. So using just throw counts and distances for intensity is unpredictable. And using one-day workload and a miles per hour reading kind of makes that more predictable. So you can know how you're going to build up workload over time. Which is what our program uses. Essentially, the traditional throwing programs also are inefficient in terms of building fitness. So at the same amount of weeks of throwing, the chronic fitness that our program has built up is basically more than double. And because of the rate that it goes up, and ours is going to go up, at a safe 1.3 ACR ratio throughout the rest of the program, like, we're going to end up significantly higher on chronic workload without ever spiking our ratio. Yeah. So it's just going to be more efficient, and it's going to be safer overall. And that's on the program we're testing. Since I started testing, I actually I'm managing a return to throw for an athlete who's returning from a full Tommy John surgery. And in putting together his protocol, I found there was a more efficient way to map out and build chronic workload, starting from a lower velocity and never spiking AC ratio. So there's an even more efficient way than what I'm testing. And right now what I'm testing is better than the traditional protocol in kind of that arena.
Dude, that's exciting.
Talk more about that guy, because he's a catcher too.
Yeah, so I don't want to get into too many details. Just it's early stages, and he's working through some of the phases. But we're 3 weeks in, and he's returning as a catcher, and catchers generally return at a little bit less, like return to previous performance at a lower success rate than pitchers. And so we're just making sure like his chronic workload needs are going to be different than a pitcher's, for example. He's actually going to need a bit more chronic workload, probably just because of the demands if he's going to be an everyday type of catcher. So we built the program around that. And also, if you think about when you look at this from a workload standpoint, a starting pitcher has to be able to have one really high workload day every week. But a catcher needs to be able to tolerate the same workload on multiple days in a row. So when you're building a program out and you can individualize it based on specific like position needs and things like that, you can make it a lot more individualized, in addition to being more adjustable, as we mentioned with the injuries.
That's interesting, because one could argue that the catcher might have to have a stronger arm than a pitcher.
Yeah, you were saying that. I was
a guy that's pulling like 150 games. You got to get it back to the guy, right?
Yeah. You're catching pens, you're doing all sorts of stuff. And if you think about, like, this is the way I thought about it when I heard that number, is that on most teams that I've ever been around, the catcher is more closely trained like a second baseman, arm strength and arm conditioning wise, than he is to a pitcher. But his demands probably exceed that of a pitcher. So they're playing catch with the infielders who are getting warm to take an infield, but really they should be on like a regimented throwing program where they're building chronic workload for a long portion of the year and getting ready for that season. And I think, to me, it makes sense that they return at a lower rate, because they probably get returned to they get in their return to play, and then they go back to playing catch with the infielders, and they need a very regimented program that's more demanding than that of a pitcher in most cases.
Sounds
at
like
least
you got
that's my
areas
thought.
to go into some studies, huh?
Yeah, there's a lot to learn, that's for sure.
A little tangent on just like, okay, so one thing, because I've had some conversations about like infielders and position players that are not, well, just infielders in general, right? How like especially younger players and their parents have a hard time understanding why, you train a shortstop like we train our pitchers. And I think one thing that I haven't really said is the infielder has to make throws off balance, weird angles. Like those are the things that, to your point, Wes, like that's actually higher percentage of their throws than I think people realize. Like most of the throws that they make are less than ideal because that's what they're supposed to be good at. And so they never really make these, like, how many infielders actually long toss like a pitcher? How many infielders, do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
it's obviously becoming more common, but it's really interesting because you almost shouldn't even, like, if I could put it on a, what you are allowed to do based on your fitness, right? You shouldn't be making these low arm slot throws, these weird off balance throws, until you've established that you can, like, you've earned that, is what I'm trying to say, and like, this is cool in that, I don't know what else to say. I'm just thinking out loud as far as like how they've been trained and how it's so backwards, no matter how you look at it. So
it's just interesting. I think it's more interesting than anything that, like, we don't know what chronic workload a shortstop should have. It probably doesn't need to be. It doesn't need to be that of a starting pitcher. Like, they're not making that many throws in a game. They are making some, like, more athletic throws or more off balance throws, but like, that's something that we should probably have an answer to. I know that the arm injuries are more of an issue with pitchers and catchers, but it's not like they don't exist among other positions. And if you could objectively condition all of your positions to have the chronic workload that they need to do what they need to do, like that seems like something that is desirable. Seems like something coaches should be aiming for.
It makes me think about like when I was watching college athletes or even the pro guys, when I was watching the guys who had strong arms, right? Like it seemed to me that the college guys that I played with, the infielders, I didn't have a guy who had a cannon. And I did notice that guy's long toss ability was just wasn't there. And looking at the protocols of what our coaches were doing, none of our infielders went beyond 120 feet, right? And so it never made sense to me, because a shortstop might make a 200 to, let's just be conservative, 2 to 230-foot throw, on a relay from the outfield to home plate, maybe, right? It's going to be that to me, maybe the shortstop throwing to third base or the shortstop throwing home might be the longest throw that guy's going to make. Maybe in the hole or something also to first base. Right. But even then, that's relative. Like we're within that window, right? That range. And I never understood why you wouldn't build up your arm strength beyond that distance, right? And build, or what you would say, build up the chronic workload so you can handle it, right? I always called it elasticity or arm endurance. So it's interesting the language that you're using with it too, because there's a learning curve to it.
Yeah, and I think to your point, there's like a couple issues there with the way that a shortstop maybe plays catch, because I think that the arm strength issue would go more towards like, what else are you doing for your arm? Because like pitchers they're doing all sorts of, they're doing the J bands, they're doing recovery, and they're like trying to get they're getting their rotator cuff stronger. Like the thing that makes a pitcher's arm stronger isn't throwing to 200 feet. Like that's building endurance within their arm, but like they're actually doing strengthening work targeted for their shoulder. Whereas like a lot of position players, it's get warm so you can play catch and then we can take an in and out. It's not, nobody's trying to throw 90 from shortstop, even though they should be. They're not working towards that. But they probably should be. They should be doing shoulder strengthening stuff, because arm strength plays at basically every position. And it's only trained at a couple. So
that's a great point.
And I will say, like most, for the record, when you talked about most infielders, outfielders, like not actually, like they throw hurt all the time. I would say like 50% of the shortstops that I've ever had, like, hey man, the great throw at short, great throw across the infield, yeah, killed me.
Yeah, that's funny that you said that. One of the best shortstops I had was my sophomore year in college, and he charged everything and was just underneath it, flip it to first base. Like he used unreal glove, dive in the hole. Everything was just like from the hip,
Yeah, so it's just interesting, and that actually so that's kind of what we've learned since then. And then we still have like more things keep coming up, right? Like every time we go out and throw, another issue pops up or another question pops up. With the traditional throwing protocol just transitioning to us being on the prescribing mound throws, which they prescribe at 50% to start. We're kind of thinking about, okay, when would we want in our program, when would we want an athlete to be on the mound? And I'd be curious to know, because it tends to vary from pitching coach to pitching coach and like what people are comfortable with. But I'd be curious to know what you guys' thoughts are of like, if somebody was returning to throw, is there a percentage level, or like when would you want them to be on a mound?
I guess I'll go first. Especially since my history in my arm, one of the things that I wanted to do as quickly as possible was get on the mound. But I didn't know, like what's the question you're asking? I had no clue when to go. So I kind of came up with this, distance thing, which is a little 90-mile-an-hour formula-ish, but it was basically like, can I throw 100 yards, right? If I can throw it 100 yards, I felt like my arm strength, everything getting to that point allows me to build all of the, you go through those up and downs, whether you get tendonitis or you need to build up the strength, the patterning, whatever's going on. I feel like it just exposes too much with the throwing, because obviously if you're pronating or supinating through release and you don't realize it, then the farther you get away, the worse those misses are going to be, right? So for me, it was just a comfortable thing. Time frame wise to what you're saying, the 50% on the mound thing just doesn't make sense to me. I never really understand it. It sounds confusing of an idea, like, what you mean, you want me to get on this mound, lift my leg like I've done my whole life, and then just like not throw it how I think my brain needs to do it. So like, I just feel like that's too much. There's too much that could go wrong as soon as you get an athlete tentative on the mound. So like, I would much rather our guys be able to like really let go of a shuffle fire, whether it was long toss or on a line, to someone, and see how they reacted a couple days later before I would be like, hey, that's because I feel like a shuffle fire and a pitch feel the same as far as like what goes through the body, and then having a little bit more momentum to me feels safer also with that. So, I think everybody's different on that. We have a good story with one of our guys coming back from TJ who went from like 75 or 74 all the way up to 93 on shuffle fires. And he was like 12 months out, but it was a big fear thing. He went 1 mile an hour at a time. And he was like, dude, I might, they only say I'm going to have like 20 throws today. I go, listen to your arm. Your arm will tell you. Your arm will tell you. If you reach back and go a little bit more, and then it was cool. Like, he started freaking out. And he was like, oh, okay, 85. Cool. And I'm like, if you can get 86, right? And so you could see when he would think about it, it would drop. He would go down to like, 83, 82 or something. But when he would think about like what he was doing, it was a completely different kid. And then he got all the way to 93. And then, from that moment on, he never looked back from the mound or anything.
So was he on the mound during that, or did he wait until he was like throwing as hard as he could before he trained?
So he was doing the traditional throwing protocols outside of us with his pitching coach, doing his on the mound work on short. We ended up having him do short box instead of full distance. And so once he went to short box, he said he felt like the timing was better. He was able to do what he wanted to do. But from that day after that, I was like, bro, you're fine. Like, let yourself recover, do all your stuff, hop on the mound after that, start small, build up your, I can't wait to say this, chronic workload now. Now I get to say that. Thank you, Weston.
Right.
Thank you for educating everybody on the chronic and acute situation. I felt like that was like geometry all over again, by the way. When you're like,
right. You got it.
I'm like, oh man, proximal. Oh.
There's formulas and everything. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it's interesting. I would say that. I don't know what that time frame is, right? So I'm interested to follow along with what you're saying.
I think the time frame is less important than, because it's going to be different for everybody, right? Like, there's going to be different hiccups for people along the way, but I think it's just like, when are you comfortable putting a guy on the mound? And it sounds like you lean towards the side of, I want him to feel bulletproof. Like, I want him to feel like they can throw the crap out of it before they get up on the mound, because I don't want them moving at sub-max speeds on the mound, which, like, I totally, like, I get that. And I think that makes good sense. Cass, do you feel similarly, or have a different thought before I move on to like the other side of it?
So I think, I totally agree with everything. I'll just make one comment on the mound piece. Is I make this comment all the time about John, and this isn't to blow smoke up his butt, but like, he is one of the best low effort throwers I have ever seen. Right. And so when John, how do I want to say it? When he modifies the way that he throws to not throw it as hard, he does it by basically chopping his knees off. Right. And so when you just like take away the ability to stride out, now you're just timing the feet, and the hands and the upper half can be exactly the same. So to John's point is like, when you see guys get up on the mound, what they typically do is they do their full tempo wind up, leg kick from stretch or wind up, and then they're forced to decel. So I really do not see a lot of athletes at any level. And I might even suggest that it's worse the higher you go, because these guys don't have to care about their low effort throws, because they can just turn it on, And so you take a guy like that and he's hurt, and then he has to come back, or just in general, right? They're actually working in really poor, inefficient patterns in these low effort throws, and then they think that that's normal, So really, this all comes down to, and apparently I haven't watched the Michael Jordan thing yet, but I know that he alluded to feel versus real. And I always talked about this as the cognitive dissonance, right? Like what, John?
Oh, I was just gonna say there was a piece of the story from Michael Jordan I need to go into because I got it. It was really
Yeah. So and I've
cool.
said this,
Weston, I
but
think you'd like it too. Did you watch it, Weston? Have you seen it?
I'm like 4 episodes in.
Oh, well, I'm gonna ruin the last
That's fine.
episode.
I know how it ends.
Yeah, you were there.
Yeah, no, I've said my piece. You get it.
Yeah. So I think there's something
So I'm agreeing with
interesting.
you guys. I'm agreeing with you guys.
Well, just for the sake of and this is why we're grappling with this, right? Because that train of thought is prevalent. That like I want a guy to feel bulletproof, and when he's on the mound, I want him to be throwing 100% because I don't want to ingrain slow patterns on the mound. And I think the reason that the transition to the mound happens when it does and happens at the percent that it does in the traditional interval throwing programs is because there was this belief that throwing from the mound was more stressful. And
one of my questions. That was one of my questions.
So I don't have, because I haven't had access to a mound, like I can't compare my data to it, but there have been much more official studies done on it. Slenker did a study where basically they compared throwing off of a mound to flat ground throwing, and they found that throwing on a mound is less stressful than throwing on flat ground. Basically, is if you can control for velocity, throwing on a mound is less stressful. So you don't have to wait until they can handle all this stress to put them on a mound because it's not any more stressful. So if it's not more stressful, why wait? If they can get on the mound and start, and I'm not saying with pitching mechanics necessarily, because I don't want anybody doing pitching mechanics at 20%, but why not play catch off of a mound when you're throwing 40%? Why not get used to the slope of the mound? Especially, obviously, only if you're a pitcher. But like, if my job is going to be to throw a baseball off of a mound, I might as well start throwing off of a mound whenever I can. So I think it's interesting.
I think
what they're trying to
do. That makes sense, even if we're not having this conversation.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
Yeah. And ultimately what I think we're going to propose in our program is that like, we are comfortable with mound throwing at any point if the athlete stays within the prescribed velocity range. Like if you can control for velocity, then we don't really care. And then the athlete and the coach can kind of decide when they want. Because if I'm an athlete that's playing for a pitching coach that doesn't want me on the mound at less than 100%, like that's when I'm going to get on the mound. And that's fine. That's not wrong. It's, it comes down to personal preference. But I kind of lean towards the idea that like, why not get used to the slope? I've heard it described. Somebody went all the way out to like huge long toss. They're at 100% in their return to throw program. And then they got on the mound and he said he felt like he was stepping off of a cliff because he hadn't been on a slope in so long.
Yeah.
And additionally, you get kids that like get so amped up, right? It's a psychological thing that like, well, I have to feel really, really good before I get on the mound again. And now it's this big event that I'm going to get on the mound again. And it's like, why don't you just get on the mound from the start and slowly work up and progress from there? So ultimately, I don't have a great answer. It's a matter of like a feel and another opportunity within our program for individualization and adjustability to like what the athlete and the coach thinks is right. But I also don't like the fact that, we wait 9 weeks in the traditional throwing program to get on the mound and then get on the mound at 50%. Like
I'm interested because the underlying theme of what I'm hearing is momentum, right? Like shuffle fire momentum, seems to be a safer throw, especially for what I feel that's personal for me. And then on the mound, what you're trying to do, create momentum, right? And so if you can create momentum using the mound and then throw it, it sounds like it's going to be a little bit more efficient and less stressful if you can not drag and stay within these ranges of motion. So, so if you're going to be, let's say you're going to be extreme on a guy, so how early are you getting him on the mound?
So that's the thing is like, realistically, I'm not going to put a guy on a slope on day one, probably. I just, for the sake of not looking like a crazy person, but I don't think that there's a reason to be uncomfortable with it. If you're going to control for velocity, it's just a feel thing. If you can control for velocity, and especially if you've got a motor sleeve on where you know what torque exposure is, like I don't care if a kid is getting 7 or 8 Newton meters of torque exposure at a very low end. game level torque is probably like in the 70s or 80s. So if somebody is getting like a 7, I'm not going to be worried about it. So I wouldn't put them on in the first week, but I don't think there's a reason to like make it this big event, and just kind of transition them, along the way. So that's not a great answer, but it will depend on the athlete. It will depend on, what they're working on within their return to throw and all that stuff.
Well, I will say it's funny that anybody has a really strong opinion one way or the other. And then I'm just looking at myself when I say this because it's just so hard to tell. I mean, going into this, we're like, Wes is like, you guys are gonna answer this question. I'm gonna say the opposite of what you say because we don't know, and you can take both sides of this. And I think that's so.
It's a good way to answer too. Like that's congratulations, you're taking a very scientific approach, and I don't know is like an acceptable answer. Like especially when you're going through it.
Yeah, and especially when there's not necessarily a good answer. And I think it's really important. Like, I haven't been super shy about throughout this whole process saying like, I don't know the answer or I screwed that up. Like the first time I mapped out the program, I had screwed up the formulas and I had to go back. Like I wrote a whole blog post about going back and changing the formulas and remapping out the 1-day workload. And I did all of this. I documented it all, and I haven't documented this part yet. But when I remade the program again for the guy that's going through it right now, I had to go back to the original, because I'm figuring it out along the way. That's
There's no
that's
guide.
what happens with
There's
anything.
no guide to this. It's
Right.
great.
Yeah. It's a work in progress.
I just thought of something that, and you're gonna hopefully you can help me with this, but. There's
John, I don't know if you saw this. We have like 10 more minutes, by the way.
Okay, perfect.
But that's
perfect.
we'll be good.
So with Modus, with your findings or your experience with it, I had it a while ago. Threw the sensor out. I got to reach out to them, see if we can get another sleeve and a sensor going with it because I think that would be great. But that being said, have you noticed a difference with the Modus between these different throwing ideas, right? Baseball, towel drill, dry throw, and plyo ball. Have you been able to see any of those?
Short answer is no. I haven't done. I've only thrown baseballs with it on since I shouldn't say that. Since I've known what the heck I'm doing with it, I've only thrown baseballs with it on. When I first got one back in the fall, just to try to learn about it, and I would just put it on and throw a bunch of stuff just to like get used to even looking at the data, but I didn't know what any of it meant at that point. So that's probably somewhere in the near future. As I get further along with this protocol, one of the next things I want to test is like overweight and underweight throws and getting into just kind of what those things look like. And ultimately what that will come down to, the reason for doing that will be like torque exposure. And this will actually lead into another question I'm grappling with that I think I know your guys' response to, but I think it's worth us discussing. But with like maximum distance long toss, for example. So a lot of studies suggest that if you get over 150 or 180 feet, you're like really spiking the torque. You mentioned Randy Sullivan had talked about the problem with long toss being that it puts a lot of stress on the shoulder, and the good thing is that it puts a lot of stress on the shoulder. So like, how much is good, and at what point do you stop? So like, when we're putting together this program, we don't really talk about distance that much, other than the athlete's going to move back with their velocity. But should we have a distance cap? Should we say you can move back as far as you want up to X distance? So I guess would you guys consider capping long toss distance, or where do you guys fall on long toss distance generally?
Can I lead?
Go ahead.
Okay. This is the one thing that jumps out to me is that the pattern of throwing up is everything. Okay. So we're going back to the mound and the slope. I don't know exactly what the degree of the mound is. Do you guys?
No, but I should.
I think
so, anyway, so let's
like
just
1 or 1.5 inch slope from a certain amount.
Right. So let's just say it's like 30 degrees. Is that crazy?
I think probably
15? 15?
Yeah, I think 15 is more likely.
Okay, so let's say it's 15. Okay. I think that the average game of long toss should get to something around 45 degrees. Okay. And so I'm more interested in how do we get a gauge on that? Because the reason that I like that is the loading patterns of the shoulder almost always improve the higher the projectile is. And it's and again, this, I don't have any evidence behind this. This is just me. I don't have any written evidence. This is just my experience with it.
Yeah, we've seen it for sure. I agree.
So when I have kids that throw too downhill, they end up having loading pattern issues earlier, right? They shift their weight too soon. So I know John is going to talk more about the max distance stuff. So I'm just saying where I go is I wonder if there is a way to like, can you play with torque? Can you get kids to land a little bit more up? Can you, if they throw the ball, this is another way to think about it. Do you know how many kids it's hard to make them throw a pop-up to themselves? You know how many people can't do that? And so little things like that to pair with this, like what is too high with the shoulders? What, can you draw parameters into that and then measure that in some way, whether it's slow motion video or I don't know, but that's where my head goes, because I just think that I don't know, that's just where my head goes. John, talk a little bit more about the max part, because I don't know how to say that.
This is my favorite part. Weston, you and I have talked about this, about Alan Yeager, and we're a little bit more in the Jaeger style of long toss camp with what we feel. But this is how I like to explain it to guys, especially when we go long toss for the first time. Let's say you and I are going to go long toss, Weston. This is what I'll say. Let's go as far as you can, right? And we're not going to count anything until we get there. Right. And then when you get there, you need to make a conscious decision and decide what your endurance level is. And each throw that you make at that distance, that's what we're going to count. We're only going to count those maximal distance throws. What I see with guys like Weston, with you and me, you're probably going to be there for 2 or 3 throws. And that's where I think people make the mistake, is it should be more of a 10 to 15 throws, giving yourself a little bit more of a break, using more momentum, trying to get a little bit more of a shuffle into it so you can stay out there. Because I think that velocity and distance is a learned thing. I think it's a feeling that you learn, especially with the feedback when either the ball doesn't make it or you miss left to the right. It's if you can learn how to throw the ball at that 45-degree angle like you're talking about, the things that really, really are crazy to us is how like seamless the momentum transition goes with guys when they are long tossing upwards, where everything sequences really, really well. They get into these really cool positions, and then the layback and the timing that happens with these guys when they're throwing up, it seems like they understand that it is a safer throw to throw upwards and long toss, so you just get more out of them. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. And so I think the huge benefit of that max distance of really just letting yourself like get the momentum and let it fly is the like building athleticism portion of it. That you're just letting the athlete kind of express their throwing motion however like is best for them, whatever is most efficient for them. I guess where I get hung up on it, because that's how I've always prescribed long toss. I've always been like get out as far as you can, hang out there, like you don't have to compress or pull down, but you should get out and let it, open up and all that. And like even when I play catch, like that's what I like to do. But the more that I've looked at stuff, I just wonder, like, obviously you want to expose the shoulder to more, well, I guess maybe it's not obvious, but to me, you'd want to expose the shoulder, the elbow to a little bit more torque than they're going to experience in the game. Like you don't want the game to be the most stressful thing that they're going to do. But how much more? Like if I go out and let's just say, for the sake of, round numbers, I throw in game, I'm throwing at 80 Newton meters of torque. Like probably 120 Newton meters of torque is absurdly too high. Like I don't need to go 150% higher. Do I need to go 10% higher, 5%? Like, so trying to decide like what amount more of in-game torque you want to expose the arm to, and then seeing where that is. Because now you don't have to guess. You can see like, okay, if I throw 300 feet, I'm at game level torque. Okay, great. Go a little bit further. But you can kind of gauge based on that. And especially in a return to throw.
I have a question. Could you go, I want you on one throw to achieve the highest torque in Newton meters possible?
I mean, you could ask them to throw it as hard as they can. Yeah. like just a max effort throw.
So let's say we're healthy enough to be able to like suggest something like that, right? I'm curious, like maybe in game is 80, but they have the potential to create 110 Newton meters of force, or torque, excuse me, or whatever it is. I don't know. I'm curious if helping them realize where their ceiling is might be helpful, and maybe that's like a really uncomfortable bad thing. I don't know. I've never even thought about that before.
Yeah, and I don't know. Like again, that we keep coming back to a common theme. Like I don't know what the right answer is, but I think that you could probably find a sweet spot out there, right? Of like, if this is your in-game torque, this is something that we're interested in training at, and how you get there then goes back to like, are we going to use underweighted balls to get there? Are we going to use long toss to get there? Because if you're looking at just torque exposure, like you can find different ways to get to these training zones. And then I think it gets really interesting, because then there's even more questions.
So it's like, I think what I was asking is, I was going to say that. So torque exposure, then what I was trying to say is, it's not the volume, right? It's like, can you expose them to one throw that is, so they have a point of reference?
Well, yeah, I think that there's value in that. I think there's value in like a baseline testing and then working some programming off of it. But also like building endurance at a certain level. Like you don't want your athlete to only be able to get to their in-game level of torque once. You want to build endurance at that level.
No, I was saying past.
Yeah, but to the same point, like you probably don't. I think it's worth testing that. But if you're gonna pick a spot 10 or 5% higher and say,
I see what you're saying,
build some endurance there. And again, I'm spitballing. Like I don't know for sure. Hopefully, I'll have better answers. If we talk again in 6 weeks, hopefully I'll have better answers, just like I did this time compared to the last time we talked. But it's
please come. Let's do this. Once a month at least. If you want to come on and update us on your situation and stuff, I think this is phenomenal work, man. You're doing some, because like basically, correct me if I'm wrong, right? But the idea of what I just said about like getting as far as you can and figuring that out, right? You're trying to quantify that idea of like what that is, right? In a long toss situation, is that
yeah, objectify it,
or objectify it or whatever it is with your idea of your efficient on ramping situation programming.
Basically, the max distance thing will fit in somewhere on the back end stages of this program or in like training a healthy athlete too. Like this is programming that will become relevant across the board. I think that, and I'd have to go back and look at the studies. I think that the problem that you do end up exposing just to higher levels of torque when your shoulders start to tilt, like when you get to those higher throws. But again, like that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. It's just that you shouldn't probably be guessing. Like you should probably know. And that's a common theme with what I've been doing is like, if you measure it, then you don't have to guess anymore. You can know that like, well, in game, he's this and long toss is this. And you can kind of set people up so that where their torque levels are and what their torque exposure is on a given day.
And I feel like it helps you know what's the difference between when I know and when I can't know. And that I think might be the more valuable thing at all, because it just, being able to decide what you can and cannot know is so helpful, So anyway, you have to get running here. So let's wrap this up. We're going to have Wes on plenty more times. It's Mill City Throwing. What are your Instagram and handles, and then we'll sign off.
So millcitythrowing.com is where the blog is. So that's where I've got like long form writing about week to week and different topics that come up. At Coach_Germain is where I'm putting most of on Twitter is where I'm putting most of the information there. And then at Mill City Throwing and at Coach Germain on Instagram. So those, I'm just kind of documenting it in a number of different places, but that's long form.
Is anybody else doing this?
I'm sure they are. I don't know where it's being documented, but I'm sure.
Okay.
Like I know there are people that are grappling with these things and trying to find ways to use Motus Sleeve in this. I will say I think it's probably less common in the return to throw protocol space, like because there's a lot of low hanging fruit in performance here too. and being able to train more efficiently. So, which I'll be transitioning to eventually, but the first thing that came to mind.
I'm excited about that. That's the information with that, especially, thinking about applying that to like, how do you throw 400 feet? Like there might be a better answer or a way to do it than every 3 days go throw.
Yeah. And how much can I throw? Maybe what you might find is that like on a given training day or on a given game day that you can actually throw more than traditional knowledge would say if you have chronic workload built up. That was one of the talk that Brian Conger gave at the ABCA. I think it was 2018. He talked about how he was able to get more innings out of his scholarship arms because he used the Modus sleeve to track the readiness. And you build up chronic workload, you track it, you're not guessing, and he was able to get more innings out of his guys. So like that's from a performance standpoint, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit as well. It's just
a huge thing for a coach. You can get your horses, 10% more output.
Yep. And in high leverage situations and know when they're ready, not, hey, how's your arm feel? Because everybody here is going to say it feels great. And it might be hanging on by it. Yeah, it's exactly. You can't trust a pitcher. Like,
Nope.
Just like a fart.
Just like a 3-1 changeup.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So, but I really appreciate you guys having me on.
No, yeah, that's what's just about to wrap up right here. I appreciate it, man. This has been great. I wish we had more time with you today. I've got way more, I've got the pad of questions right here for you. So this has been awesome. Thanks again, man. I can't wait to have you on again. You guys go follow Weston, millcitythrowing.com. I just pulled up his website. Looks great. You follow along. If anybody has any questions, you can ask us. We can relay it to him, or you can just hit him up directly. So Weston, thanks again, man. I appreciate it. We got to get you a hat eventually. You're gonna
all right.
Stuff out. So all right.
Yeah. Thanks again. It was great. It was great talking with you guys.
You too, man. Good luck. Take it easy, buddy.